Hey everybody, I'm Jonathan Hoover, and I'm so excited to take another opportunity to answer some of your questions about emotions. We're in a series right now at NewSpring called All the Feels. We're talking about how does God want us to approach our emotions, and we're kind of integrating some good psychological science with scripture, which, by the way, I find those marry together very well. And we're looking at our emotions, which can sometimes be problematic for us. And we invited you to write some questions in that maybe I could address in some of these videos. And so I just want to take a minute and go over some of the questions that have been written in for this week. There's kind of two questions here that are kind of on the same path. One is, how do you deal with emotions from someone who has hurt you in a big way? And the other one is forgiveness a feeling, right? Because when we're dealing with past pain, somebody's harmed us in some major way, we're going to be dealing with both the fallout of that emotionally, the sadness and the pain, but also we're going to be dealing, especially for those of us that are God followers, with the question of forgiveness, right? I want to please God, and God is very clear with this. It even is in the Lord's Prayer that we're to forgive those who trespass against us because God has forgiven our trespasses. How do we process all that? Okay, well, a few things. One is it's very important for you to be honest with yourself about the offense that occurred. So, and what I mean by being honest is to take some time to really think about how to sort of wrap your arms around what actually did happen. Because some of us overinflate the offense, right? That can happen, where I start to think that something that someone did to me is much worse than what it is. On the other hand, and I've seen this a lot, sometimes we can sort of try to minimize an offense. And part of that is in hopes of forgiving. Maybe if I minimize what they did to me, then it'll be easier for me to forgive that person. But actually, we're not being honest with ourselves about the offense, which we need to do, right? We need to be able to be looking at what happened, because that's going to help us make wise decisions for the future. I'm not hanging on to a grudge, but what I am doing is I'm allowing my past history with this individual and what they've done to me to inform my future decisions. And we'll talk about that in just a second when we get to forgiveness. The second thing I would say is know that big wounds require big weights. So what I mean by that is when I'm wounded very deeply, there's going to be a longer time of recovery, right? That's going to be associated with the pain that comes from that. And then number three is I need to make sure that I am learning the lessons from the emotions that I'm experiencing. We talked about this in the first week of the All the Feels series, that emotions are not good or bad. They are indicator lights that let us know something is going on. And when we pay attention to those indicator lights, we have an opportunity to learn something about ourselves and the way that we process emotion and about the situations that we're in. Now, what about forgiveness? Because that's a really important topic. And I kind of brushed on this a little bit in the last video. But some people have the idea that forgiveness is a feeling, and I will know when I have forgiven somebody because I will feel something that tells me I've forgiven them. Well, I would say that the biblical picture of forgiveness is a choice, right? It is tearing up a bill and saying, you don't owe me anymore for what you did wrong. And again, as I said last time, the reason we're tearing up that bill is because it's an unpayable bill. Nobody can ever exactly make up to me what they've done wrong. There's no way in our human estimation of wrongs and faults that we could adjudicate how much somebody owes me for what they've done wrong and make sure that they pay me back. And so part of not holding a grudge is saying, I'm not holding this over your head that you have to somehow pay me back for this, right? But that's very different than the feeling that most people are talking about when they talk about feelings of forgiveness. Usually what they're talking about is feelings of peace. I'm going to feel that I'm at peace with this person because, that will tell me that I've forgiven them. No, peace comes later after forgiveness. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose that you run me over with your car. I would prefer that you didn't, but let's suppose that you did run me over with your car, and I'm very hurt, and you come and see me in the ICU of the hospital, and you say, Jonathan, I'm so sorry I ran you over. I feel terrible about this. Will you please forgive me? Then I can forgive you at that moment. I can say, you don't have to make it up to me that you ran over me with your car. You don't have to pay me back. But on the other hand, if you were then to say, all right, so hop up, get up out of that bed, let's go I'm going to take you to lunch to make it up to you. Well, I can't hop up out of that bed right then. I'm still very, very wounded, and there's still a lot of recovery left that has to happen. And beyond all of that, there's a question of wisdom of whether or not I want to be around you when you're driving a car in the future. That has nothing to do with forgiveness. That has to do with wisdom. Is it wise for me to put myself in a situation where someone can harm me again when they've harmed me previously? So again, there are kind of these multiple facets of the question. One is, have I in my heart said this person does not have to make this up to me? I can do that in day one. I truly believe if you look at Genesis, at the story of Joseph and his brothers who sold him into slavery, I believe, I can't prove it from Scripture, but I believe Joseph forgave his brothers on the first day when he was being taken off into Egypt as a slave. But that's a very different question than whether or not he can restore his brothers to privilege. And if you look at the end of the story where Joseph's brothers show up in Egypt, Joseph tests them to see if their heart has changed. Now, what I'm not suggesting is that you should create some elaborate test to find out if somebody who's harmed you has had a change of heart. That worked for Joseph. But what I'm suggesting is you do need to know one way or another if the heart has changed, right? Because in order to restore, there needs to be that change of heart. So hopefully that makes sense. That I am doing what God did. God tore up my bill, right, when he forgave me for my sins, and I can tear up someone else's bill. But that doesn't mean I can immediately hop up out of that hospital bed and recover. It also doesn't mean that I should necessarily put myself in the same position to be harmed again, right? And there is an emotional part of the healing process, right? That as I am in that hospital bed and healing through that, there's pain, sometimes trauma, that's part of the story of how I was harmed. And I can't just make those emotions go away. And I shouldn't just make those emotions go away. They're there to teach me something, and they're there to remind me that I need to work through some stuff. So hopefully that's helpful. Good question here. When does anger turn to sin? I'm wondering about Matthew 5:22, where it says, "But I say, if you're even angry with someone, you are subject to judgment. If you call someone an idiot, you are in danger of being brought before the court. And if you curse someone, you're in danger of the fires of hell." What about anger towards someone who has hurt you? Okay. So you heard me say, if you were here with us on the weekend where we talked about Emotions 101, you heard me say that emotions are not bad or good. They're just indicators that let us know that something's going on. You might think, well, sure seems like Jesus is saying anger is bad. Well, first of all, we have to remember that Jesus was angry at different times in the Gospels, right? There is such a thing as righteous anger, and I think that's what this person is asking about. How do you know when it turns a corner from righteous anger to unrighteous anger? And then the other question is, a lot of times people read this verse and are very concerned about, is my anger going to damn me to hell because I have, angry thoughts? Is it going to send me to hell because this almost sounds like what Jesus is saying? You have to remember that when Jesus is talking to these individuals, he's talking to people who think they are going to get to heaven by following the letter of the law. And one of the things he's trying to communicate here is they all get that you shouldn't kill somebody, that is a sin, and in their minds that would keep somebody from going to heaven because they've not done that. They've not killed somebody, so they're good. And Jesus is trying to help them understand that anger is on the same paint chip. Killing somebody is just it is a very destructive pathway that anger can take you on, right? And so he's saying, look, you're not sinless just because you haven't killed somebody. If you've been angry at somebody, contemptuous, a lot of what this passage is talking about is contempt toward another person, considering them to be worthless and telling them that they're worthless, right? And so basically what Jesus is reminding us is that he cares about our attitudes, not just our actions. I think that's a lot of what he's saying here. And I think he's trying to remind these people who think they're going to get to heaven based off of how good they are, that it doesn't work that way. So I hope that's a little reassurance for you. Those of us who have a relationship with Jesus Christ, we're going to get angry sometimes. Sometimes we're going to not handle our anger in the best way, but that doesn't jeopardize our eternal destiny in heaven. And beyond all of that, it reminds us of our need for a Savior who continues to work his work in our lives as we continue to mature in him. But let's talk about when anger goes from being healthy anger to unhealthy anger. So again, anger is a feeling that lets me know that things are unfair, that something is unjust. Or another way that anger can show up is if I feel like I'm being blocked. I have a goal, I have something I'm trying to do, and something is blocking me from that or making it more difficult. So healthy anger is when we feel that emotion and when we allow it to either teach us something, when we allow it to motivate us to do something good. I mentioned in my last video the illustration of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, right? That you have a mom who lost a child whose anger motivated her to start this very important organization. And so sometimes our anger can really motivate us to do some very good things, to fix problems, right? Other times there's really no way we can fix it, but we can actually go through a refining fire of that anger, of letting it work itself out within us and we work it out with God and we deal with it and there are emotion-based coping skills that we can learn that will really help us through that. But anger becomes unhealthy when we start doing destructive things with it. So anger doesn't make me do something destructive. Anger does definitely cause me to be geared up, right? The more angry I am, the more geared up I can be. But some of us have habitually learned to do destructive things when we're geared up, partially because of something we talked about in the last video. Our brain has really changed the way that it's functioning. And so there may be a little bit less of a filter. We may be a lot more sure of ourselves. We may not regulate our impulses very well. And so all of that can kind of play together to sort of set us up to be ready to do some things that could be destructive, right? And yet it's important to understand that our anger doesn't control us. Like our anger cannot dictate that we do destructive things. And we can be angry without doing those things. We're going to talk a little bit about that, by the way, in this message and the next message, the last two messages of the All the Feels series. So if you feel like I'm struggling to know what to do with my emotions or even how to adjust, I would say that's probably a good word, adjust to regulate my emotions. I really encourage you to be here for the next couple of weeks because we're really going to go deeper into that. But I would say you can always step back in a time when you're angry and ask yourself, am I making things better or worse? I know it sounds crazy, but I can actually, in a state of anger, make things better. And if I am making things better, then that can be healthy anger, right? But on the other hand, if I'm actually making things worse, or if I'm doing something that I know God would not be proud of or happy with, or if I'm doing something that I can clearly look around and recognize I'm causing problems for people around me, I'm making things harder for them, that's when I know I'm letting that anger go to a destructive place and I need to definitely back up, right? One thing I teach is the CPR model that I've taught now for quite a while in terms of when I start to get angry, especially as it relates to, works within relationships. So CPR stands for calm, polite, and receptive. So I do say this. I think that when you're trying to engage in a relationship, and this could be at work, this could be in marriage, this could be with parenting or whatever, when you're angry, you need to ask yourself, before you start engaging with that person, before you start trying to solve problems and move the ball down the field, you need to ask yourself, can I be calm right now? If I can't be calm right now, then I need to wait. I need to do some deep breathing. I need to kind of get grounded in the space, and I need to let that initial anger subside. And so I would say if you can't be calm, you need to calm down. The second thing is polite. Now, I didn't say kind because kindness is an attitude. You may not be feeling kind. You may not have those feelings that would push you towards a kind attitude. But the question is, can I make the choice to be polite? Can I be polite in the way that I word things and the way that I respond, right? And then the third thing is receptive, right? So receptive meaning, am I ready to have a discussion and not a monologue? Right? So when we're angry, often we make speeches, but we don't listen. And so I need to be honest with myself. Am I actually ready to give and receive information, not just give information and hope that somehow the other person will accept everything that I'm feeling and thinking right now? So hopefully that helps as you try to regulate the anger thing. If you tend to be an empath, what are some tips to know if you are having said feelings? If you are having those feelings, or if you're taking on someone else's feelings, and how do you navigate that in daily life? For instance, walking into a room with people in it and then feeling emotionally overstimulated, but being totally fine before you walked in, or being in a discussion with your marriage and navigating whether you're feeling a certain way or if you're actually feeling these feelings. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so two things. One is, it's wonderful that you're an empath. That's fantastic, right? The more you can be empathic, that is a mark of psychological maturity, right? If we think about one of the hallmarks of psychopathology, a person that you might hear someone talk about as a sociopath or a psychopath, we don't tend to use the word psychopath much anymore, but when you think about those, generally speaking, the hallmark of that is an absolute absence of empathy, an inability to understand how other people are feeling and also how my actions are impacting other people. So empathy is a very, very powerful tool, but it is possible to lose that differentiation between myself and someone else, and so I sort of go into their emotional world and it can create problems for me. So it is important to kind of have an idea of how to be empathic, but also not to take on another person's burden to the extent that it now becomes my own, right? In counseling, we call this containment. I'm going to contain this emotion that this person has. I'm going to hold it, and together we're going to look into it and we're going to look at it. But I cannot carry this home with me, so I'm going to have to sort of set it aside when I'm done with it. And it's kind of the same sort of idea. So I would say, first of all, your natural tendency to be congruent with what other people are feeling, your feelings and their feelings there tends to be just a natural merging of them. So you feel like you can walk into a room and kind of feel what they're feeling. That's a lovely thing. Don't be mad at it. That's a good thing. On the other hand, it's good to have a good mental conceptualization of this idea of how I can feel that with them, and then walk into a different room and kind of go back to my normal feelings that I was feeling before I went into that room, right? And we can do that to different levels depending on the intensity of what that person was feeling when we encountered them. I like to think of it this way. If I were going to go buy a new suit, I don't have a lot of suits because I don't wear a lot of suits at NewSpring, but I do have a suit that I wear when I speak at funerals or weddings. And whenever I have to buy a new suit, I'll go to the department store that sells them, and I'll grab 5 or 6 off the rack, and I'll take it to the dressing room, and I'll try them on. And when I try them on, I'm looking to see how it looks in the mirror. I'm feeling how it drapes. I want to just get a sense for it, right? But I don't have to own it. It's not mine yet, right? I can actually go back and put it on that rack and walk away from it. I'm just trying it on. But for the period of time when I'm trying it on, I'm very focused on it, and I am getting all of the feels of what is this like. And so I think about when I'm with someone who's going through something that's very difficult, right? And I do this a lot as a pastor and pastoral counselor. I think of it like God has called me to go into the dressing room of their experience. I'm going to try their experience on, right? And while I'm there, I'm going to feel the feels with them. I'm going to, the same way that I would look and see how the suit hangs, how I would feel, whether or not the fit feels right. I'm trying on what they're feeling and what they're experiencing. That gives me an opportunity to talk to them about what they're going through and to hear what they're going through and to get a good idea of what their experience must be like. But I don't have to own it. It's not mine, and I kind of keep in mind that this is not my experience. This is their experience. And so I'm moving into it with them, but for a limited time. And then I'm going to set it aside the same way I would put a suit back on the rack and say, that's not mine, but for a period of time I was able to experience it. So hopefully that's helpful. My question would be about being conclusional. This is something we talked about in the first week of our series. We said that fights don't tend to come from being emotional. They tend to come from being conclusional. So I draw a conclusion about the world or about the situation or about you, and I say, I feel like this. So I could say, I feel like you don't care about me. Well, actually, that's not a feeling, right? A feeling would be like, I feel sad, I feel hurt, I feel angry, I feel frustrated, I feel happy. But when I say, I feel like you don't care about me, actually, you don't care about me is a conclusion. And I'm saying, I feel that. The other person is probably going to disagree with me. They probably feel like they do care about me. And so we're going to be off to the races with an argument. And so that's what this person is talking about with being conclusional. They say, does this mean we are overthinking? I think that's my biggest problem. I overthink instead of getting in touch with what I'm feeling. Well, overthinking. I definitely have that same disease, right? We talk about this like getting into our head and starting to play out all kinds of different scenarios, hypotheticals, making guesses about what other people are thinking, making guesses about what other people's intentions are. And I think we have to recognize that God gave us our grid for understanding the world as a benefit. So I don't think it's good for us to look down on the fact that we try to process things. That's a good thing. Processing is a good thing. But when it becomes a bad thing is when we find that we're getting into loops of negative thinking, anxious thinking, starting to maybe have some very negative self-talk. And when the way that I process things is feeding that negative self-talk, feeding those sort of like decisions that aren't playing out well for me, that's when I probably need to think about adjusting the way I'm thinking. So I'm not suggesting it's about thinking less and feeling more. We're all going to think naturally and we're going to feel naturally. It's going to be more like, all right, is my pattern of interpreting the world, or in psychology we call this your interpretive style, is my pattern of interpreting what happens to me, is it helpful or not helpful? And if it's not helpful, I may need to sort of work with some of my core beliefs about myself, about the world, about my future. Those three are especially important to think about how should I restructure what I believe in order to help me have better self-talk so that when I'm thinking about things, I have more productive thoughts that then help bolster up emotions that are more congruent with what I feel like I should be feeling in the situation. I don't know if that helps. It's probably the best feedback I can give. So my young adult daughter, sorry, let me go back to this page. My young adult daughter refuses to have anything to do with me. Oh, that's got to be so painful. She believes that I'm emotionally unstable. I've encouraged her to go to counseling alone or with me, and she said she is not the problem, rather I am. I know I've made mistakes. I've owned them and asked for forgiveness from those who I hurt. They refuse to even allow space. How do you manage all the emotions of grieving for a child who is still very much alive? Oh, that's such a complex question, and I'm not sure in this brief Q&A that I have all the answers that you need. Grieving is very difficult, especially when that person is still somebody that you're going to run into, right? It's hard enough when you grieve someone who has passed away, but there is some finality to that. But one of the things with going through a broken home situation where your kids no longer want to talk to you or where there's been a divorce is that you're grieving someone who's still around, that you may still encounter. And there is also that reminder in your head that there could be reconciliation, but there's just not. And that's another sort of grief as well. So it's very difficult. And a lot has to do with kind of what has happened in that relationship over time, right? Those stories are very different, and kind of what what a counselor might suggest that you do would have would vary somewhat based off of what the story is. But I would say this is maybe the one piece of advice I could give, but it's not exhaustive. I could film a whole video just talking about this one topic, but the one piece of advice I would give is invest your time in being a safe and trustworthy person, right? So it sounds like there has been some pain in the past in this relationship. I would invest your time in being a safe and trustworthy person to the extent that the other person can witness that and see that there's change over time, right? That can be a very positive thing that can sow the seeds of reconciliation eventually. Often that person has no contact with us, and so it's not necessarily that they can see we're doing this really hard work to be safe and trustworthy, but God sees, right? And so at a minimum, we continue to do the work of working on ourselves, being a safe person, being a trustworthy person, building healthy relationships and social support as we kind of go through this grieving time, asking the Lord to help us process those feelings of pain and loneliness. And then as we do all of that, asking the Lord to witness for us that we're trying to develop that trustworthy character and safety, and see what the Lord does over time. I will say this, patience is definitely important in these situations because when there is that sort of lack of connection and it's like, oh, it feels like it's never going to get better, it's never going to work out, it's important to remember that time does change a lot of things. And so use the time wisely, try to take the steps that God is calling you to take, but also know that just because this is the way things are today doesn't mean it will always be this way. And hold on to hope, because you never know what God will be able to do. I've seen God reconcile some very broken relationships over the years, and certainly I'll be praying for you as you work through that. I'm struggling with a lot of negativity within myself. I know right from wrong, and I'm ashamed of myself. I continue to follow the wrong path to addiction with alcohol, trying to mask the pain. When you're dealing with your emotions in an unhealthy way, how do you change your coping strategy to healthy choices? Whoa, such an important question. And again, something that deserves way longer discussion than what I'll be giving it here. But first of all, you talked about pain. You're experiencing pain, and alcohol has become the way that you're dealing with that pain. And a challenge with alcohol is that it does initially calm the whole brain down, right? We know this from research. Initially, it calms the whole brain down. So if I'm feeling anxious and hurt and especially feeling a lot of emotional pain, it can kind of dull that. But there's nobody to wave a flag and let you know that you've gone too far with the alcohol. And at a certain point, what happens is there's sort of a selective activation of the brain where the more intelligent parts of our brain are really kind of getting lulled to sleep, and the more emotional, reactive parts of our brain come back online with a vengeance. And so there's a couple problems with that. Number one is we kind of create problems for ourselves when there's that much alcohol involved, so we can do some very destructive things. But beyond all of that, the other issue is that our brain learns to do what it rehearses. So what I mean by that is the more we get to that very emotional, unregulated place that we get to with alcohol, the more our brain is learning to go to that emotional unregulated place, right? And so we have some evidence that as a result, there may be more nightmares, there may be more acting out when you're not even drinking. And so alcohol is not a good coping strategy for pain. I think you know that. That's why you wrote in. And yet I want to sympathize with you, because when you have a coping strategy that is kind of working, but is also creating new problems, that's a rough spot to be in. It's a really tough spot to be in, because it's very difficult to let go of something that is helping you survive, even though that you know that thing is hurting you. So I would highly suggest that you think about working with a trained therapist who can help you think about some different ways of coping, especially somebody who has some addiction training, who is aware of how difficult it will be to lay aside the old coping mechanism and develop some new ones. But that's really what I would recommend, because ultimately this is going to be it's a tricky process, but it's one that you can absolutely do. You can do this, but it's a little tricky to set aside something that is kind of working for something that, Lord willing, will work in a big way and not have those negative consequences, right? So I would really encourage you to do that. And also know you're not alone. There are so many people that struggle with this, and there are so many people who've been able to conquer this, and I have faith that you can as well. God is going to be there for you as you work through this. I would encourage you to be cautious about the shame. You mentioned shame, and shame is a feeling that we start to look down. It's really a conclusion, right? Shame is a conclusion that I look down on myself and say, I'm such a failure. I'm so messed up, right? And I begin to have this very, very negative self-talk about myself, right? God never calls us to be ashamed of ourselves. God calls us to have godly sorrow, which basically means I'm sad, right? That's an emotion. I'm sad that I've made choices that have hurt myself and others, and I don't want to keep walking down this road, and I'm going to do my best to make a turnaround. I know I'm going to have setbacks. I know I'm going to have difficulties, but I'm doing my best to turn the ship around because I'm sad about what happened, right? Sadness about what happens allows me to still recognize that I have value and worth. I was created by God in His image, and I'm gonna make it through this. Shame, on the other hand, tells me there's no point. I'm going to continue to be a failure. I'm going to continue to be a mess up, and actually, shame ends up being part of why we get motivated to continue on in the same behavior, because if there's no point, if I'm never going to be able to kick this, if I'm never going to be able to get any better, that's going to motivate me to go out and drink again, because I'm going to feel like, what would be the point of battling and doing the work to fight this addiction when I'm not going to win anyway, right? So really saying, okay, when I feel shame, I need to see if I can reorient that a little bit towards godly sorrow. I'm sad. That's what's motivating me to feel the shame, but I need to stop short of drawing the conclusion that I'm a bad person. I need to feel that godly sorrow, that I'm making a choice that isn't good, and I'm sad about that, and I can make a turnaround. And with God's timing and God's grace, I'm gonna get there. So my counselor wants me to keep a journal of my feelings and emotions throughout the day. I'm really struggling to do this. How do we even recognize and name our emotions? Okay. So there's so many ways to do this. Let me tell you my favorite. My favorite way is to use what's called an emotion wheel. There are different versions. Plutchik's wheel is out there. It has, I think, 32 emotions on it, but I may be wrong about that number. There are other emotion wheels that if you look online, they have way more emotions than those. Basically what happens is in the middle of that wheel, there are the primary emotions: angry, happy, sad, surprise, right? They're all in the very middle. And then it spokes out into more and more nuanced emotions, right? And so one of the things that I like to do, just as a fun little exercise, is get one of those emotion wheels, laminate it, and get yourself a dry erase marker, right? And if what your therapist is asking you to do is to track your emotions throughout the day, put that emotion wheel on your desk and take that dry erase marker, and whenever you think about it, circle the emotions that you're feeling right then. Take a picture on your phone. Your phone's going to keep track of what time of day it was and what day it was that you took the picture, and you can end up with a nice little catalog of emotions that you were feeling at different times. You and your therapist can piece together, are there certain environments and times when you're feeling certain feelings more than others? What's the, how often are you having feelings that sort of group together into the same category? There's all kinds of awareness that can come from that, right? But there are other ways to use the emotion wheel as well. I used it a lot in my marriage coaching ministry, where I would have people laminate an emotion wheel and put one on the fridge and put one in the bedroom. So when they would get into a conflict, I would have them stop right then, and each of them circle the emotions they were feeling. And often that was a great way of sort of disarming a little bit of the fight, because again, if we can get to the emotions, there's definitely a lot less to argue about, because I cannot tell somebody their emotion is wrong. Their conclusion may be very different than my conclusion, but their emotion, I have to accept. If they're feeling sad, I have to accept that. If they're feeling angry, I have to accept that, right? But back to your original question of just monitoring throughout the day, I really like the emotion wheel for that, right? Because again, like I said, it gives you all these options and choices. And as you look across the wheel, as your eye scans across the wheel, it's amazing how quickly you start to, oh yeah, that is how I'm feeling right now, right? You might, like I said, you can use it as use it over and over again tool if you're going to use it like a little whiteboard and take pictures of it. But that's just one way of doing this. But that's a great way of monitoring those emotions. Lots of other ways, but that's probably my favorite. Last question, and this is one that's come up multiple times, so I'm going to make sure we address it. What boundaries are needed for someone who is a narcissist versus a regular or normal kind of person to protect oneself from emotional abuse? Okay, so this is a little off the beaten path of the topic of emotions, but it's an important topic, so it deserves airtime. And that is, how do I set boundaries with a person who is abusive? When I do marriage work, I always tell people there are 3 levels of marriage work. And whenever I sit with a couple I haven't worked with before, I'm always sort of conceptualizing where are we at in this sort of 3-level or maybe 3-stage model, which the first one is safety. There has to be safety. If there's not safety, we can't work on anything else yet. So there has to be safety in the relationship. It has to be physically and emotionally safe. Then the next step is intimacy. So in marriage, we're trying to create that special bond that's more special than the bond that we have with any other person. And then if we're fortunate enough to have a relationship where we're like, yes, it's very safe, yes, it's very intimate, then we move to that 3rd level of legacy, which is what is the footprint that we're going to leave on this world together? What are we going to accomplish together as a team in this world? And we could port that from marriage over to just general relationships by changing our wording a little bit. We still start with safety. Safety is key in any relationship that I'm in, whether it's at work or even in an extended family relationship or whatever. Safety is still the base level. And then we could change it to the next level, to connection, right? Once I have safety with a person, I may want to feel connection with them. Maybe I want to spend some time with them. I want to hang out with them. Like maybe they're a good person to have in my life because they're a good influence or whatever. So I may be working on connection. And all of us who have friends know that connection sometimes is better than other times. Every once in a while, something will happen that kind of wounds the connection. We sort of repair it and move on, right? But if we get to the point where we're super, it's a super safe friendship or relationship, it's, we're super connected, then we might move to cooperation, which is working together on something that's important to us, right? So we might work together on some sort of a goal. But what we're talking here about, when we're talking about an abusive person, they're a person who's creating a lack of safety in the relationship. So we're rewinding the tape all the way back to the most basic level of relationality, which is that I can trust this person not to wound me or harm me in some way. And when a person has proven themselves to not be trustworthy, and so this is not a safe relationship, boundaries are very, very important. And there are multiple ways to conceptualize boundaries. I talked about one way on my Facebook page the other day. But another way of looking at boundaries is looking at them as access points, right? So back when I was going to college in Pensacola, Florida, there was an outer gate that you had to go through that had security guards before you could even get on campus, right? And then there was another gate that you had to get through before you could get to sort of the dorm areas. And then once you got into that area, there was locks on the dormitory building. So unless it was a time when the dormitory was supposed to be open, you couldn't get into the dormitory. And then once you got in there, right, then there were access to each of our rooms, right? And so if you think about that, there are different boundaries that you would have to put somebody outside of. If they're not supposed to be on the campus, then you would want to put them outside the furthest boundary. If they're supposed to be on the campus but not have access to the dorms, then you would want to put them outside that boundary. If they're supposed to have access to the dorms but not to your room, you would want to keep them. And so a big question here is, what does wisdom tell me about how much access this person should have in my life? And this is a good metric. If the risk is low, the lower the risk, the greater the access I can allow this person. So if they've had a track record of trustworthiness with me, and I have no reason to believe that they're going to harm me in some way, right, then I can give them a lot of access, right? But if that person who I've given a lot of access to then somehow harms me, I'm going to need to step their access back a little bit, right? And so my decision about how much access to allow someone is going to be based on how safe they are for me and how much risking with them in the past has not been a good decision, right? And so the question is, when should I move someone outside a boundary to a further boundary? Well, that would be when they've broken my trust. On the other hand, the question would be, well, when do I take somebody who's broken my trust and give them more access? That's when you have seen observable change over time. Not because they say, I'm never going to do this again. Not because they say, everything is cool, I totally get what I did wrong, and I've got it all, I had some sort of, we've had folks that have contacted the church to get us to somehow give a reference for them that they've had some sort of magical moment of life change, and now they're not going to do the destructive things that they've done before. It just does not work that way. God knows whether that's true, and it might be. God knows whether somebody's heart has completely made a turnaround. God knows the minute that happens. That's why the Bible says God evaluates people by looking on the heart, but we don't have that ability. We don't have that X-ray vision. We have to evaluate someone based off of, as the scripture says, their fruits. We have to evaluate someone based off of their actions. And so until I can see that their actions represent a change of heart over time, so not over a week or 2 weeks, but I'm actually seeing that there is character change that allows me to believe that this boundary isn't going to be crossed in the future, then that's when I can bring that person a little closer in. And even at that, I like to think about this as a probation. I'm going to give them a little bit of extra access, and I'm going to see how they do with that. But if having that access over a short period of time, it's clear to me that nothing really has changed, then I'm going to move it right back where it was. And that may sound kind of harsh, but the truth is God has boundaries, right? God has, the Bible tells us that if we draw near to God, God will draw near to us. And I think the opposite is true as well, right? I think the scripture is telling us that how we interact with God has a lot to do with how much distance there is in our relationship. And that's the same thing with other relationships. We love individuals and we forgive them when they break our heart. But on the other hand, the extent to which they have access to us, that's going to have a lot to do with wisdom. What is the right choice? So I hope that's been helpful for you as we've been talking about emotions this week. A little bit of a preview for this weekend. We're going to be talking about how do we adjust our emotions, right? So maybe the emotion that I'm feeling right now isn't the emotion that I want to be feeling. I want to be feeling something different than what I'm feeling. Sometimes that can be avoidance, and we're just trying to get away from something we really do need to feel. But other times, it's because we need an adjustment, an attitude adjustment. And we're going to be talking about that this week before the last week, which I really am excited about, where we're going to be talking about emotion power tools. We're going to be talking about a toolkit that you can put together of things that you can do to regulate your emotions. I'm looking forward to both of those weeks, and we hope to see you there at NewSpring Church this weekend.